Today we look at chapters 10 and 11 of Nehemiah. And as we ended yesterday, I read verse 38 of chapter 9. I'm going to do that again as we begin. Because of all this, we make a firm agreement in writing. And on that sealed document are inscribed the names of our officials, our Levites, and our priests. And chapter 10 then goes on to list many of the officials, the Levites, the priests, the government officials, and others of the Jewish community who signed this document. And, it began with because of. Well, sometimes, in the New Testament especially, we see therefore. And anytime we see because of or therefore, what just happened? So what just happened was Nehemiah's prayer that the people would follow God and that God would remember his people, and that, all of the remembering and the teaching within that prayer that Nehemiah did. And so, I'm not going to read the names of all of these people that signed this, but there's quite a few priests, and then there's quite a few Levites, and then verse 14, the leaders of the people, and then verse 28, the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who were separated, acknowledge and understand and join with their kin. And then it says, enter into a curse and an oath with God, and I think about that, a curse and an oath. The oath, if they do what God instructs, there's blessings. If they don't do what God instructs, if they don't follow the will of God, then it's a curse, because bad things are going to happen. And so in some ways, I don't really like to look at it as a curse, but it's the because of or the therefore, if you don't or when you don't adhere to the teachings of the law and to the will of God, these bad things happen. But the people respond, we will not give our daughters to the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. And if the people of the land bring merchandise on the Sabbath, we won't buy it on the Sabbath. We will honor that day, and we will keep it holy, and we will forego the crops on the seventh year, the tithe of the reckoning and the resting of the land. And, it's just, that Sabbath. And it always, when I think about that, the rest, the land rest, it, reminds me of the summer follow that we used to practice, and how, we let the land rest in order to help take care of weeds and for it to regain moisture and nutrients and all of that. But, and then it ends with the extraction of every debt, and that every person will contribute our yearly obligation of a half a shekel. And a half a shekel isn't an awful lot. And I looked it up, and it said, well, if you were looking at it on today's silver price, and they use a $17 for silver price, well, yesterday's silver was $70 and something an ounce. So, but at $17, it was around $5. So if it's at 70, which is, say, roughly, 5 times as much, it'd be about $25 per person that they are paying, for the temple supplies and all of that. And at $25, that doesn't sound like much, or, but, in their day, that bought a lot. It's just like when I was a kid, a dime went quite a ways, and a dollar bill was wow, but, everything changes a lot. But, the Jewish community agreed then to, follow God and support the temple and to support the priests. We've cast lots among our priests, the Levites, and the people, for all of them what they are to do. And then the last verse of chapter 10, we will not neglect the house of God. And to think about, to neglect the house of God doesn't mean so much to let it fall into disrepair, although that's a part of it. But I think, neglecting the house of God would include, not attending for worship, not taking care of, not observing the Passover and the other feasts, and doing the things that you do in the temple of God. And within all of that, again, too, the teaching of our youth. And this was one of the big things that had happened throughout the history of the Israelites, that, I mean, they had forgotten about the Passover. I mean, how did they forget that? I mean, God has said, this is a yearly ordinance. You shall remember this on a yearly basis, the Passover, the Festival of Booths, the first fruits, and, you know, but somehow, over all of the years, those things got forgotten. You know, the book of the law. And it's, you know, in today's society, the Bible is becoming less and less revered and not regarded as holy, and the infallible Word of God, and the degrading and the downfall of society is I truly believe it's tied into not knowing about God, not knowing about, but not knowing God. And because I've said many times, there's a difference between knowing about God and knowing God in that. But anyway, they're not going to neglect the house of God. They're not going to neglect worship. They're going to pay their temple tax, and they're going to try to follow the Word of God. Chapter 11 is kind of a continuation here now. Nehemiah is again speaking, and he's talking about the leaders of the province, and, you know, not so many people were yet living in Jerusalem, but it's kind of, we need to have certain people living within the town, and certain people, you know, living in the outlying communities. And chapter 11, you know, kind of talks a little bit more about some of that. You know, the leaders of the province who lived in Jerusalem, but in the towns of Judah, they lived on their properties, you know, and all. So they had places to be, and you know, we had read yesterday or the day before that there weren't very many people living in Jerusalem, even though the walls had been built and the safety was there. But and there's a list again of the people that come to live within the town of Jerusalem, you know, leaders of the province, and then there's the Benjamites and of the priests, and, you know, there's lists of the different names of people, and again, it's genealogy is tied in here, you know, because it's not just Jedediah, but it's Jedediah, son of Joachim, you know, Sariah, son of Hilkiah, you know, and so it's, you know, it's that connection. And connections, I mean, connections are so important, and not just within family, but within communities. And I think about, you know, the different civic organizations we have within our communities. You know, I think about our schools. I think about, you know, just family friends, you know, childhood friends, our classmates, you know, and, you know, as we get older, maybe there's not quite so many of our classmates around that we see, but, you know, for the kids in school, their classmates can be a very important part of who they are, but also they can be, you know, a thorn in the side. We know that from bullying and everything else that way too. But anyway, we have in chapter 11 a list of those who live in Jerusalem, and, you know, then also talking about some of the villages. You know, verse 25 says, as for the villages with their fields, some of the people of Judah lived in Kiriath Arba and its villages. So Kiriath Arba wasn't, you know, maybe it was like a county or a sub-state. I mean, you know, we have states in our union, we have counties, and we have townships, and, you know, so, and it's villages. And it, you know, it's kind of a reminder that in the New Testament, you know, we hear about the Decapolis, which was an area of 10 cities, you know, a geographical reference that way. And so we see the listing of who lives where, and how the Israelites are repopulating not only Jerusalem, but the land of Judah, the promised land.